Good morning, everyone. Last week, Rick Santorum, he got up and he told an audience that America, unlike other countries, was built on a blank slate. He went on to say that Native American culture was not a part of his American culture. How did we get to a point where a former U.S. senator and a public personality who's appearing every day on CNN could publicly disavow the existence of an entire culture and still have a job the next day? Honestly, it took a lot of things. A lot of them are profoundly terrible. I mean, horrific acts, genocides, Trail of Tears, Wounded Knee, isolationism through the reservation system, breaking of treaties and promises. Once the isolation was in fact, the stripping of natural resources and culture and religion, really profound things to get to the point of being able to ignore an entire people. But it took a lot of smaller things too. It took the mythologizing of American Indian people and culture. And we did that so we could comfortably pretend that they do not exist. And if we do that, we don't have to come to terms with what we as a country have done to those people. And in this mythologizing, that's where mascots come into play. That's where our conversation is relevant today. I took a look last night at a list of college and high school mascots, just kind of pulled it up in Wikipedia and took a look at the list. And I saw griffins and leprechauns and Sasquatch and lake monsters and dragons and demons and tritons and all sorts of other extraordinarily unusual and unreal creatures. But there was only one culture that I found homogenized and packaged under a single name, and that was Indians. And we wonder how it's so easy to pretend that the American Indian people don't exist, how it's so easy to ignore them. It's through both the horrific things that we've done, and it's through the smaller acts of discrimination that we continue to do today. When you put a group with a bunch of fairy tales, it's easy to believe they don't exist. We hope to change that today. So again, thank you and welcome. My name is George Welch. I'm a human rights attorney with the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. I have had a long interest in American Indian issues and rights. I grew up in Philadelphia, so not naturally a place where you would think that passion would grow, but it did for me. And kind of involved both my professional life. I've been an attorney now for about 15 years. I spent 10 of it as a public defender in New York City and in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I joined the CHRO about a year ago. And one of my top priorities was moving to try and end the discriminatory practice of using American Indians iconography and images and names as mascots. So I thank you all for putting some time aside to talk about the issue today. I think it's important because we've reached a flashpoint in our culture right now. It's an exciting time to have this conversation, honestly, because we are seeing movement. And there's been a long time, and a lot of people who've been having this conversation for a long time, where we haven't seen movement. And we're seeing that now, so it's important that we take that catalyst and that we run with it. We're seeing social movements, political movements like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and we're seeing that public energy rise up and being willing to attack the status quo. And I think it's also, especially talking in the context of mascots, to point out that we're seeing it in sports as well. We're seeing Colin Kaepernick kneel during the national anthem. We're seeing large-scale WNBA protests. I mean, culminating with an owner essentially being driven out in Atlanta. We're seeing LeBron James refusing to just shut up and dribble, as his critics have told him to do many times. The sports world is now taking a look at itself in ways that it hasn't in a really long time. In ways it hasn't since athletes like John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised a gloved fist at the Olympics, or since Muhammad Ali refused to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
We need to take this moment, capture that energy, and rid ourselves of this cancer of tolerance and discrimination that's going on right now. And to just give you a brief context of the people we're talking about and the issue we're addressing today, some context that men like Rick Santorum want to pretend doesn't exist. There's between 2.5 to 5 million, depending on whose numbers you like better, people who identify as American Indian in the United States right now. That either, about 2 million or so either live on reservations or directly identify with a specific tribe, and up to around 5 million claim to have American Indian heritage of some sort. It's also important to note, and I hear a surprising number of people not realizing that reservations are still a thing. There's over 300 reservations in our country right now. We have 5 of them in Connecticut specifically. So it's a huge issue, and it's a huge part of our culture. Just here in Connecticut, right now, we still have approximately 15 high schools that are using American Indian mascots or imagery directly in their promotion of their school sports or school name. We have mascots like, these are real mascots Connecticut's using right now. Indians, Red Men, Chiefs, Warriors, Red Raiders, Red Warriors. These are names that are still being used today at around 15 high schools in a real direct capacity. So this is a problem that's serious in Connecticut, is larger in Connecticut than in a lot of other places. And honestly, it's something that we need to take steps to remedy as soon as we can. First off, I am honored and humbled to have put together a really great group of people today to have this conversation with us. I hope it can be a free-flowing conversation, where we sort of cover a lot of different topics, surrounding this issue. So again, thank you so much for coming. And just as a brief introduction, we have Shaquana Sebastian, the former chairwoman of the Mashantucket Pequot Youth Council and the current events coordinator for the Office of Travel Secretary. We have Katherine Miner, Manchester High School alum who helped lead a grassroots effort to remove her high school mascot that was known as the Indians. We have Professor Bethany Berger of UConn Law, an expert in federal Indian law. And we have Paul Lucas, a journalist, storyteller, and artist. He's the founder of UniWatch, and you may have also seen his work on the New York Times, GQ, Sports Illustrated, Spin, ESPN, many other things. I personally liked your Grommet project, but that's my personal taste. But there's a lot of different places where you may have seen Paul. So just if each panelist would take a moment to introduce themselves and maybe express why they have a passion for the project, I'd appreciate that. So Shaquana, if you'd like to go first.
Hi everyone, my name is Shaquana Sebastian. He already gave me a little brief introduction, so I won't say more. I became interested once I saw how it affected children in my community, but also around, just the stereotypes, and also just growing up and kind of thinking that it was normal for people to ask like all these outrageous questions about being Indigenous and actually having a reservation 5 minutes from the school, and they still are unaware of how we live or who we are or anything like that. So definitely take a big notice into that and decide to speak up.
Thanks, Shaquana. How about you, Catherine?
Hi everyone, I'm Katherine Miner. I am a graduate of Manchester High School and a current freshman at Northeastern University, where I'm a music major concentrating in ethnomusicology and social justice. And while I was at Manchester High School, with some of my peers, I started the student activist team where we changed our school mascot from the Indian to the Red Hawk. It was a process that lasted over a year in 2018 and 2019. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to participate in this conversation with all you.
Thanks, Catherine. And Professor Berger?
So yeah, I'm Bethany Berger. I teach here at UConn Law School, and I began working in Indian country as a law student, working on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. And after I graduated, I went to the Navajo and Hopi reservations as director of their youth law project. And I saw there all the difficulties that Native youth were having in their educational setting. And in general, and after that, I worked in New York City and saw similar difficulties in public education, where I did public interest work for students in public schools. And so my commitments are both to racial justice generally, to Native nations and Native people, and also to educational quality. So that brings together all those three things intersect with this issue.
Great, thanks. And Paul?
You're muted.
Okay. So I'm Paul Lucas, and I'm a journalist who specializes in writing about uniforms and logos. It's a specialized niche of sports writing, and that means I write about logos that include Native American iconography, and I also write about team identity, meaning team names, and basically anything having to do with the visual aspect of sports, and that includes a lot of Native American depictions. I also, because I'm writing about these things, I interact a lot with people who are very passionate fans, and rooting for a team is often as simple as rooting for a logo or uniform, because the players come and go, they get traded, they retire, etc. And we are really often, as Jerry Seinfeld famously said, we're rooting for laundry, and so meaning the uniform. And so I go into the sort of connections that fans have with teams and team identities, and that definitely includes connections to logos, and that definitely includes Native American logos. And I've been writing about this for over 20 years, and it's basically impossible to write about uniforms and logos without addressing and approaching this issue.
Great, thanks, Paul. So as you see, we have a broad panel, and please, panelists, I encourage you. I'll direct questions to to one of you specifically, or maybe to the panel generally at times. But please, if you want to jump into any question, please do so. If you want to ask a question of another panelist, because something has kind of served as a catalyst for a question for you, please do that. We have a good period of time here. So I'd like to try to have a free-flowing conversation where we can address a multitude of topics. So again, I really appreciate y'all being here, and thank you so much. So I guess I'll start. Maybe I'll start by directing a question towards you, Shaquana, if that's all right. And you started to address it a little bit in your a moment ago when you were introducing yourself, but what's your personal experience with American Indian mascots? How has it impacted you? what's your personal story with it? How have you kind of seen it, interacting with your tribe, and how has it impacted your life in real ways?
Well, the name and the imagery kind of sets off a tone anyways, as if like, I don't know, we're kind of wild or something, and like savages, and it's kind of like derogatory, so then that plays into just like would play into like my everyday school life. Also being Black and Indigenous, I dealt with like both sides of the thing, of the spectrum, of people saying that I'm not Native, and some people just asking like if we live in teepees or if we ride horses, or like they have this stereotype already without actually knowing. And growing up, that kind of like did a lot to me, when it came to like my culture and even being able to rep it, because I just went through so much. I've always been a behind the scenes type of person, so like that's why I've been on youth council, like, and doing things like that. It just made me not really feel comfortable with being open, about who I am. So when it came to like our culture and like dancing, like at powwows, or depicting like a Native American in that kind of way, like I would stay away from it and stick to like the background part of things. So I think just being able to spread knowledge to others who already have their own understanding of us, or however you want to say it, I think would go a long way. And that's why I like the panels like this, because there's other children who are like me, or also mixed, with different other races and stuff. So just want them to be able to be proud of who they are, no matter what, and be able to always speak freely and be able to do whatever they want. So it definitely goes into a lot of things. And I spoke about it before in the article that I did. It's really hard trying to conform. Like, you still want to be able to live your regular life, but then you're also brought up, like me, I've lived on the reservation since I was 5 years old. And then you just have a hard time trying to conform. Like, what do you want to do? Like, do you just want to like not have any involvement and just continue to go to school and like try to be regular? Or do you want to be involved with your community and your culture and everything else that entails because of people's own opinions, or what they were taught from someone else, or what they see, without actually knowing the whole truth?
I'm really interested in what you just said about trying to be regular. What did you view regular as, and how was that sort of template of regularness established for you?
Just growing up, I guess, like we have always like my cousins and I, like we've always been around each other. We've had our own daycare, like on the reservation, summer camp, we're always together. So once we had ventured out, I would probably say like middle school, high school, that's where, things got a little complicated. And, then you're starting to figure out your own self. Um, and then you split up into like your own groups, and, all this. So then you're just trying to find yourself. So that's, kind of gets into your head a little bit of like what you should do, because then growing up in a predominantly white school, they always had like something to say, or like, oh, like, why do you do this? Or like, why do you look like this? And like your other cousins look like this. Like, they always wanted you to all look the same and do the same thing. And like, so it was just really hard trying to continue to stay yourself. And then you're also just flourishing, like you're growing into like your own person. So it's just like, it was definitely, I didn't realize how hard it was until I probably got older and realized like, wow, I probably didn't have to go through all that, So, definitely just want to speak up, and hopefully the younger generations won't have as much problems as the generations before them did growing up.
And did you think the interplay of the stereotypes that you would see from, white culture or mascots made that transition more difficult for you, or do you think it played in any way, or not really?
I definitely think it has, just because that gave them their own kind of like image to really judge us by. Because like I said, just growing up, they already had their own things from the mascots that they saw, or whatever type of imagery it would be towards Native Americans, indigenous people. That's kind of what that's where they learned it from, like cartoons, how they like had them all like redskin or like just whatever, like this is how they grew. So it turned into like, you're supposed to look like this and you're supposed to do this, and why don't you live like this and do this? And it's just like, we're still like just regular people. So I definitely think it played into that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Paul, I think part of this is starting to go into an area I'd like you to talk about, if you don't mind, about a term that I know you use a lot when talking about this issue, appropriation. How do you define appropriation? How do you see it on display, in this area?
Yeah, I think the discussion on this issue of the use of native imagery and names in sports often devolves way too quickly into people just saying, "Oh, that's racist," or "That's offensive," and that usually isn't very helpful for the discussion, I've found. No one wants to hear that they're a racist, or that if they like something, that it is racist, and so people tend to shut down. And offensive is essentially a term that is so subjective, especially in today's culture wars, that it has become, to my mind, essentially meaningless. And what I have found instead to be a more useful framework is the notion of appropriation, which is using something that doesn't belong to you, and in this case, using a culture or a set of cultural images or signposts or signifiers that don't belong to you. And that's why people often say, well, what's wrong with the Minnesota Vikings or the Boston, like if you have a problem with the Cleveland Indians or the Washington Redskins, what about the Minnesota Vikings? What about the Boston Celtics? And the issue there is that those are examples of a culture celebrating itself. Minnesota was settled by Scandinavian immigrants. And so when they decided to call their football team the Vikings, that wasn't appropriating somebody else's culture. It was celebrating their own culture. Boston is, or at least largely was at the time the Boston Celtics were founded, a city of Irish American immigrants. And so they called their team the Celtics. Similar to the New York Yankees, a team that plays in a city in the North. And so those are all examples of a culture celebrating itself versus a team or a city borrowing or taking or exploiting another culture's set of imagery and cultural signposts. And that to me is a much simpler and useful framework for discussing this, because most of us are taught at a very early age not to use something that doesn't belong to us, not to take something that doesn't belong to us. And I think people can sort of get their heads around it much better in that sense. And it's sort of a less inflammatory framework as well. I also think that a lot of this has to do with the stories that we tell about ourselves, similar to everything from monuments to historic markers, team names, school names, town names even, become part of the story that we tell about ourselves. And I think a lot of this debate is who gets to tell those stories, who gets to decide which stories get told and how they're told, who has the power to make those decisions, and who are just characters in the story. And I think for a long time, Native Americans have essentially just been characters in the story, in other people's stories, rather than having ownership and agency on their own stories. And I think that's what a lot of this debate is about.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's a really useful framework, Paul. So thank you. And what's the harm in taking from another culture? I mean, it's something that's been, practiced in music. I mean, you hear the Rolling Stones and the Beatles have stolen black culture and trying to move on. I've heard the argument. what's the harm in taking from someone else's culture?
There are various forms of art, including satire, and where artistic influences are definitely, there's a lot of borrowing and cross-pollination, if you will. And the kinds of things you were just mentioning are like pretty basic examples of that. It's worth mentioning that the Rolling Stones have been criticized a lot for appropriating a lot of Black culture. They were sued by Willie Dixon for taking songs that didn't belong to them, and so there. I mean, it's not just as simple as saying, "Well, other people do it too." And I think there's a difference in doing things in the world of art and doing things in the world of civics and the civic sphere or in the world of basically big money sports capitalism. I think it may not completely be apples and oranges. There's a little bit of an overlap in the Venn diagram you're suggesting there, but I don't think it's exactly the same thing. And again, because I think it contributes to the establishment and the reinforcement of a storyline. And storylines are powerful, and people bond with them. And when certain people are essentially marginalized or written out of the story, or don't have the power to assert their own place in the story, and just become characters in the story, I mean, as a society, that strikes me as sort of obviously a bad thing.
So, Shaquana, I'll come back to you for a moment now after we, since it's Paul kind of set up some framework for us. What different perspectives have you seen in your tribe? I mean, is everyone universally of one voice that the mascot practice, particularly in Connecticut, is wrong, that it is appropriation, and that or are there people who view it as something else, as respectful or as a tribute or no big deal? And how do you find that interplay between the people in your tribe?
So there have been some conversations. Like, I know there's some people who kind of don't want the mascots taken away because they feel like they'll be erased from history, and then we're already forgotten or just not really respected. And there's some who are very with it, and they agree that it's disrespectful. And I learned to take it from both perspectives, because it's a pride thing as well. So I truly let people have their own opinions. But I would say, as a whole, definitely the mascot and the imagery is disrespectful, just because I don't think any of the schools really have any type of any plaques of this is for whatever town they're in, this is dedicated to this tribe, this, that, and the third, or anything, any type of recognition towards the tribe. And I know they say that it's a respect thing, but I feel like they're just throwing it out there just so they could keep the mascots. So I guess it just really depends on how it goes in the future. But if there could be some type of respect, we're reimagining respect, and I just feel like there's no respect that's really given, and they're just saying it to say it.
If I could, I've heard a lot of the sort of counterpoint of view that Shaquana just mentioned, that usually not from Native Americans, but from non-natives, who say, if you take away the team names and the logos and the mascots, well, then Native Americans are just going to be forgotten because that's all they have, which strikes me as just so patronizing, and also a really odd approach to public policy, that if there is a disadvantaged or marginalized group in society, that the answer to that is to somehow name a team after them. Are we going to have teams called the unemployed, or the opiate addicts, or the homeless, like, because that, hey, no, otherwise they won't get enough attention. That's a good way to spotlight it. It strikes me as sort of absurd on its face.
No, absolutely. I can't agree more. I mean, it's so consistent with the kind of thing that, Rick Santorum was just saying that I started with. I mean, that sort of complete erasure is just so troubling. And then to address it through caricature is ridiculous. So I'm interested, Shaquana, and you say that you respect the people, whose opinions are different in your tribe. Do you make attempts to try to change their opinions, or do you just view that as, they're from a different time or they have a different priority, and that's not for me?
Yeah, I mean, I would say most of the people who have reached out or that I've spoken to about it are people who have just, said their opinions. I truly just let their opinions be, because that's from their point of view. We're still indigenous. We're still from the same tribe. So however they want to take it is how they want to take it. But at the end of the day, if majority rules, then that's what it would be. But I'm not going to get into an argument with my own family member about their views on something that they,
Sure.
came up with. So I just took the time to understand them, and I understand where they're coming from, but I also have my opinion as well, and we can still be family at the end of the day.
I mean, we've all been going through that these past 4 years, right? I mean, that is not it. We've all been experiencing family tensions in that way to some extent. I'm sorry, was someone else? One thing that I think you can provide a unique perspective on, given your role with the youth council. What are the young members of your tribe thinking about this? Is there a youth movement? Is there energy about this issue with the young people? What were you seeing while you were leading that youth council?
There's definitely an urge for the youth to speak out on many topics and things. I actually had spoke at the Killingly Board of Ed meeting earlier last year with her name is Lynette Hernandez. She's my cousin as well. She's on the youth council currently still. She's the vice chairwoman. And a lot of them are always open for to speak up, and definitely with any movement that that leads things in the right way. And so, but I think over COVID, it's been kind of hard getting in touch with everyone throughout for communication purposes, but they definitely do love to speak their mind. And that's what I love about the youth in our community, is that if they do have a problem, they will definitely speak up. Even if it's with another tribe, our sister tribes, we always support them as well. So it's definitely a united front.
I think that's where a lot of the energy for this movement will come from. So that's great to hear.
Yeah.
You mentioned Killingly. There's some, I'm sure there's some people on the call who don't know about what's happened in Killingly, Connecticut, and probably some people on our panel who don't know what's happened in Killingly, Connecticut. So would you mind describing sort of what's gone down there?
Well,
I'll describe what's going down in Killingly.
When we actually had showed up, I honestly didn't know how much tension there would be. I definitely felt when we walked into the meeting, you definitely feel the tension. Prior to showing up there, I had done my research just to make sure we knew what was going on. And it looked like they had brought up the intent to change the logo. And then something with some politics had happened. They had a vote for it. Was it their school board? The education?
Yeah, I believe that's right. I mean, just for a bit of the context, it was that the school board in Killingly, Connecticut, they had been the red men for a long time. A school board was elected, and they actually changed the name. They got rid of the name Red Men, and I don't remember what they became. I don't know. Do you remember, Shaquana, or Red? I'm sorry.
I think it was Red Hawks.
I think that's right. I think that's right. So they moved away from Red Men to become the Red Hawks, and then they were the Red Hawks. Like they were the Red Hawks for a period of time. Um, an election took place. The politics of the school board changed, and we're not talking about the 40s or the 20s or a couple of years ago. The school board changed, and they decided to actively go back to being the Red Men. They abandoned the Red Hawk change and made a decision to go back to being the Red Men. So that was sort of the context for the meeting that you went to, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what did you find at that meeting when you were there?
I just felt like there was a lot of tension. The room was definitely split. You can tell there are a lot of teachers and students as well who were very open for this change and rooting for it. And I really love to see that. And then honestly, the other half was still kind of split on it. But it doesn't take anything but to keep spewing the knowledge out and hopefully being able to turn people's opinions as Katherine did at her school. So I just think, definitely when it's youth led, it'll definitely be a much bigger voice. And I think people will take more notice to it.
Absolutely. And what a good time to ask Katherine a question. So Katherine, you were at Manchester High School, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the Indians were the mascot when you were there. Is that right?
Yes, our mascot was the Indian.
Okay. And then you led or helped to lead with a group of people, a grassroots movement to change that mascot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Could you talk about that a little bit? Like what that looked like, how you organized it? Just sort of give us a sense of how that worked.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in 2018, winter of 2018, myself and some of my other peers kind of began to do some research into the history of our then Indian mascot, and kind of we had heard from administration that that they would support a student-led change. So we had a lot of motivation there, and then we educated ourselves kind of throughout that winter and early spring, and then in 2018, May of 2018, we sent out a survey to the entire student body and staff population, just basically asking their thoughts on the mascot and whether they thought it should change or whether they were against the change. And for context there, our numbers were 46% of people that took the survey were for a mascot change and 35% were against the change. And then throughout the next year.
And that's when you started. That was when you began the project?
Right. We hadn't done any formal education really or conversation around what may be wrong with the mascot before that original survey. And then after that, we really spent a year kind of running our educational campaign. We reached out to a bunch of sources, the Manchester Historical Society. We used a statement from the National Congress of American Indians, and we reached out to some other people. And we really just led a grassroots education campaign in our school, on the ground, speaking to students and teachers and people in the community about this issue. And we really tried to have it be as much in-person, kind of casual conversation as possible. We were sitting down at lunch tables and talking to our peers in the cafeteria, in the hallway, because we thought that's what would be most effective. And then a year later, in May of 2019, after a year's worth of that education, and also a few Board of Ed meetings, and a full community forum where we invited the entire community, not just students and staff, we sent out a similar survey asking people their thoughts, and we had 57% of people for the change and only 14% of people in our school against the change. So those numbers went down from 35% against the change to 14.
That's
And
that's quite a change. It's remarkable.
Yeah, thank you. So that's kind of a general overview of how our process worked and kind of the timeline of what happened. But I can definitely answer any more questions.
Yeah, question, like something that, how do you get from like cafeteria conversations? It sounds like that was like where you think you had your biggest impact. Is that fair to say? Like you think that was a real, where you were able to change people's
Yeah,
minds?
those types of conversations I think were one of the leading factors, yeah.
So how do you get from, just having like the most basic sort of interaction, a conversation in a cafeteria with your classmates, to convincing a school board to change? I mean, it seems like there must be, how do you take that energy from a cafeteria and turn it into a force that takes a government entity and changes its mind?
Yeah, so after kind of a few months of talking to our peers and kind of educating ourselves and educating the people that we were around in school, we wrote a formal petition that we kind of had in lunch waves around school, after school, for people to sign. And that was, again, like lunch table to lunch table, like, will you sign this? Talking to people about why they should or why they didn't want to, and having those conversations. So we got a significant number of signatures on that. I think about 700, and our school was about 1,400. So we got signatures on a petition, and then we also used a lot of the data from the surveys that we had sent out, and we compiled that information. We also used a lot of our research. So in our conversations with the Manchester Historical Society, in our like finding of old newspaper articles in which the Indian mascot was really used in a harmful way, and created, just had a bad impact. We used some of these sources, some other people who had leadership positions in tribes in Connecticut, and we cited all this. And then we presented in May to the Board of Education with all this information and our school-specific data and perspectives. And they agreed to put a vote, like a school board vote, a month from May, so in June of 2019. And also, a public comment kind of section that night. So from May to June, in between those two Board of Ed meetings, we also had our community forum where we invited anyone to come kind of share their opinions on the situation. And a lot of those people also went to the public comment. A lot of students were at the public comment in the June meeting. And then after that kind of public comment section, the board, it was time for them to vote, and they voted unanimously in favor of the change. So kind of after our presentation from the month before, kind of contextualizing the issue, and then after our community forum a few weeks previous, and then the public comment section that night, they voted in favor of the change. And now our mascot is the Red Hawk.
The Red Hawk. Right. How big was your group when you started? Like, how many of you were had a meeting and said, "Hey, let's do this"?
Yeah, there were about 6 of us who.
It's crazy.
Kind of there from the beginning, but
yeah, what an important lesson to learn from that, right? 6 of you leads to 700 signatures and a unanimous Board of Education vote. I mean, that's the energy that we need to tap into right there. I mean, would you have advice to anyone else who's either a high school student or someone who's in their town and cares about the issue of how they might be able to start creating that sort of momentum that just 6 of you were able to start and eventually, make a change?
Yeah, sure. So, like I kind of mentioned, we spent a year trying to educate ourselves and other students. So I think that is something that needs to happen for the change to be ultimately successful. I don't think you can just kind of, and it also helps that it was student led. I don't think that um, like administrative leadership could just take it to the Board of Education within like a month without really addressing the roots of the problem, and have it be as successful. I think we spent a lot of time trying to contextualize the issue for students, and participate in conversations that weren't necessarily like calling people out or trying to tell people that they were wrong, rather than just giving them the history of this mascot and explaining to them the harm um, that kind of was done as a result of it. So I think the education is really important, and kind of this like back and forth, excuse me, back and forth dialogue rather than just all this information coming from one person to the other. And then also something that I think was really central to our group, was it was a really diverse group, and within the six of us, and then also some more people joined our group and played varying levels of roles. But we had um, captains of sports on our teams, captains of varsity sports within the six of us, people really involved in the performing arts, like so people who were doing theater, people who were doing music, people who were in band, people who edited our yearbook and created it, just within the six of us. So I think that having people who represent the school in many different ways is instrumental, because then you have a wider reach and you can really kind of see how people in different little pockets of the school may feel about being represented by this one thing. So that's the other thing I would recommend, is just um, speaking to people who are not only athletes. I think that's sometimes the first.
All right. I think we may have lost Catherine there for a moment. But no, I think the points that she was making were really strong about getting a different cross section and speaking to people in different ways and making sure that you know have a lot of knowledge in your background. Um, I guess I'll ask. Let's see if Catherine was back. No. So I'll ask you a question, Paul. I know that you know you're a sports fan. I know that. I'm a sports fan. I mean, I grew up in Philly. I'm a Philly sports fan, so I'm probably less than fully stable about my sports thoughts and opinions myself. So, and honestly, I don't know Shaquana or Professor Berger or Catherine if you guys are sports fans or not. But you know, it is, and I think you touched on it in your talk on appropriation earlier, Paul. How do you respond to sports fans who say that you're taking something real away from me? You know, this is something that means something to me, and it meant something to my dad, and it meant something to my granddad, and I'm passionate and love this thing in a real way. I don't love it I love it in a way that's irrational. It's something very important to me and my family. How do you respond to people who say you're taking that from me?
First, I think it's important to acknowledge that as you say, it's not rational, but it is very, very real. Sports loyalties, they make no sense. As I mentioned earlier, the players come and go, but you keep rooting for whoever's wearing the uniform. That's not particularly rational. It's like a really intense form of brand loyalty that we don't see anywhere else on the consumer landscape. Because normally if the quality of a product or the content of the product changes, so does the resulting brand loyalty. But with sports, the content and the quality of that content is changing all the time. So it is a real thing. It shouldn't be mocked or dismissed. And as you mentioned, George, sometimes it spans generations. And sometimes the only thing that a father and a son or a grandson and a son have in common, they may disagree on everything else, but they root for the home team together. Right. And so it's a real thing, and it does provide a sense of glue in some sort of, in communities and in families. And so when somebody says, you're taking or threatening something that is special to me, and that I feel an emotional connection with, I think it's important to acknowledge that and to say, I hear what you're saying. I get it. If it were my team that was coming under scrutiny, or whose logo or iconography was coming under scrutiny, I would probably be upset too. But the team also represents the city or the town or whatever the local community is, and you can still remain loyal to that, under any name. And you also have to consider whether this thing that is dear to you may be causing harm to other people, and that that it's not just about you, and that it's about others. And that doesn't mean that you personally have caused harm, or that you had any malice in your heart, and that standards change, and what is acceptable at one time is not necessarily acceptable at another, and that we learn and grow as a society, and certain things that were okay at one time are not okay now. And we're starting to think that some of these team names and logos and types of imagery are not okay. And I get that that's painful for you, and I don't belittle that or mock it, but I ask that you consider the bigger picture. And that's what I've usually tried. That's been what I've tried to tell people. It was something along those lines.
Sure, no, it's definitely a helpful thing, because it's it's a real issue. And you speak about the harm, and Shaquana and Katherine did as well. So Professor Berger, I have a question for you. I know there's been efforts in the field to quantify the harm that actually goes on by these naming practices. I know there's been a Freiburg study is one that comes to my mind. Would you be comfortable talking about that Freiburg study a little bit, and some of the results that it showed?
Sure. I'd like to put this in context.
Sure.
These name mascots, and as my students know, I like pictures and PowerPoints, and I believe Spencer has some quick slideshow. So I first want to touch on the theme of invisibility that Shaquana brought up, and then talk about what some other of the other people here mentioned about, and you mentioned about, what does it mean to have these mascots? Where do they fall in the other mascot situation, and other mascots that we use? And then talk about the harms both to Native youth, but also to general issues of federal Indian law and policy, and also to the educational harms to non-Native youth. And then maybe we can go into some of the law here. So if
Sure, we might break that up a little bit, but yeah, I think that sounds good.
It's going to be very quick. So if Spencer could pull up the PowerPoint, that would be great.
Yes, just 1 second.
And I want to, while he's doing that, I just want to start by thinking about how present Native peoples are in our society, but in a way that lets us pretend that they no longer exist. So I'm here in Hartford. Many of you are here from Connecticut. Connecticut is an Algonquin word for the place of the long tidal river. So many of our other place names reflect. Next slide, please. Am I able to switch slide? Okay. So you may not be able to see it. It's coming up pretty small on my screen, but this is basically Connecticut, and these are all the Native peoples that were here when non-Indians got here. So the Nipmucks, the Mohegans, the Pequots, the many peoples that you may not even think of, the Wangunks, the Quinnipiac, the Tungus, and the Narragansett. And so where we are today is because of our taking land and sovereignty from Native peoples. And part of why we use these mascots is because of this idea of a kind of noble, strong people that has been conquered. Next slide, please. And still today, there are about over 2,000 teams that use Native mascots. There are about almost 10% of high school teams. And these are the kind of things that fans and opponents do with these mascots. And I think if you can imagine, so this is the Tennessee Orangemen, an ad about beating the Florida Seminoles, referring to the Trail of Tears, and really offensive language regarding Native peoples. The Trail of Tears, for those of you who don't know, is when the Seminoles and other tribes were forcibly removed from their homelands, and about 1 in 4 died. This brings to mind the burnings of crosses by the Ku Klux Klan. These are what used to be called the Redskins fans, painting their faces red to supposedly look like Indians. And imagine if this was somebody in blackface. Imagine if we had a team called the Yellow Men or the Black Men that was supposed to refer to another race. And now getting to your question. So given that invisibility, next slide, please. What does this mean for Native youth? Next slide, please. Thank you. And so Shaquan, oops, back. I didn't see the first slide. What does this, Shaquana mentioned that people were asking her, you know, saying this to her, you don't look like an Indian to me. It's because we've got all these images of what Indian people look like that are all rooted in the past, that all don't have to do with being regular people in modern society. And so psychologist Stephanie Freiberg did, with co-authors, did these studies where they primed Native youth by showing them images from some of these images. Some of the images were kind of negative, like the cartoonish Cleveland Indians image. But some of the images, and with a different group, were perceived as positive, like Pocahontas, who we think of as a kind of honoring image of Native people. And regardless of whether they got positive or negative images, the result was that Native youth felt less ambitious for themselves. They felt less positive imagination of what would happen to them in the next year. They had felt less, they had more negative images of their own community. So there's a significant loss to Native youth growing up. But I also want to point out the loss to non-Native youth. So we're talking about educational institutions. And by using these images, we're educating those youth that you can take another group's race and culture and hold it up and deal with it in the way you want. Take ceremonial and sacred images like headdresses and use them for your own purposes. In addition, just thinking about the moment that we're in today, there's, you know, we've got 2 original sins in this society in America, slavery and colonialism. And I think there's a significant argument that these mascots kind of celebrate colonialism. We used to have these fierce, noble people, and they're not here anymore, and we've just absorbed them within ourselves. And so finally, last image, and I'll turn this off. So one of the very positive things for Native youth, who have the highest suicide rate of any ethnic group, is identifying with their cultures. But as this cartoon shows, if the image of the culture is associated with a sports team, that doesn't get to be their culture anymore. So this kid is saying, wow, for this boy going to a powwow, wow, cool outfit. So what are you, a sports team mascot or a Disney character? And there's also a federal Indian policy. So if we imagine Indians in the stereotypical way that mascots present, then we imagine that tribes should act in stereotypical ways. They shouldn't do modern things like engage in gaming or businesses. They shouldn't be of multiple races as they are. And so former President Trump in the 1990s objected to tribes in Connecticut engaging in gaming, saying they don't look like Indians to me. They're white, they're black, they're not Indian. And so this is a Native man holding up a sign referring to that, saying he doesn't look like a president to me. And so with that, I'll stop and you can ask me questions about legal stuff.
Sure, well, some, and then a little bit about, I might go back to some of it in a bit. But I'm interested in one thing particular about the Freiburg study that I want to pull out a little bit. And you had mentioned that the intent of the imagery didn't necessarily relate to the impact. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So as you've heard, one of the common arguments is that, well, these aren't negative images. We're using things that we like about Native people, that they're close to the earth, again, stereotypical, they're close to the earth, they're strong, they're honorable, blah, blah, blah. And the Freiburg study tried to test that, to say, okay, if there are images that we think of as positive, and so they use both the Pocahontas image, which is kind of a feminized version of the close to the earth, friends with the animals and stuff. If we use even images from, was it the American Indian College Fund, showing people in Native dress working in a lab, and then asked students non-connected questions about their sense of themselves, whether they had ambitions for themselves to go to college, to have professional jobs, what they thought about their communities. All of those were negative. And there wasn't a significant difference between those and the images that everybody can perceive as negative in the impact on Native students.
Great, thank you. And it reminds me, and I'll jump back to you in one moment, Professor Berger, but this reminds me of a conversation that Katherine and Shaquana and I had last night when we were preparing for for this meeting. And we talked about how you responded to people who said that, you know, these images are respectful. Leave me alone. Like I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to be respectful. And you both had different takes on how you responded to that. So I don't know if Shaquana, you wanted to address that.
I'm trying to remember the conversation. But
the way you would respond to someone who says that the mascots we use are respectful, as opposed to, and so because of that, we should be able to keep using them.
Yeah. So I think I probably said something about it a little earlier in here. But basically, they're saying that, but like they're not really doing, like they're not really respecting us. I just feel like they're saying it just to be able to continue to still use their mascot and the imagery that they do, when all it takes is like some knowledge and for them to really open up their perspective as well, and see that it's just completely and outright wrong. I guess it would make sense, as I said before, if they were actually honoring the local tribe that they're honestly trying to like mimic. I think that would go a long way. Or even if they had a relationship with them and that other tribe was understanding and they came to an agreement of some sort, I think it's just not respectful. And that's probably what I'd say.
Thanks. And did you want to comment on that, Katherine? Because I know you had some thoughts as well on that particular issue.
Yeah, I get that a lot. And I think most people who are kind of going through a movement like this do. And usually if someone said like something along the lines of, but we're honoring Native Americans, normally I would just say, oh, well, what tribe is our school built on the land of? And most people would not have the answer to that. But if they did know that it was on the land of the Podunk tribe that we had committed a genocide against, then I would say, oh, then what like traditions or aspects of culture specific to the Podunk tribe are we like reflecting in practices related to our mascot? Like, um, and at Manchester High School, our mascot was de-emphasized in 2012. So since I was at the high school, there weren't like any kind of costumes or even like really after my freshman year, any logos on sports apparel. But in other situations, like, does that headdress that you're wearing even reflect what the tribe, the specific tribe that you're claiming that you're honoring, even wore? Because in a lot of cases, like, people just create this monolithic idea of a culture without actually and claim they're honoring that entire group of people without actually looking into like specific things that a specific tribe did. So that was normally how I would respond to something like that.
How people respond to you?
Um, I think it was a mixed bag, but as soon as as soon as most people kind of realized that they didn't know much about the local tribe they were claiming to honor, I think they did open up a bit more. And obviously, there were still people at the end of the day who wanted the mascot, didn't see what was wrong with having our Indian mascot. Um, but I think a lot of people's opinions changed, and like these questions that I would ask, like, well, what tribe are we honoring? Like if the answer was I don't know, then I think that be like helped them kind of like reset their own mindset in some situations, and obviously in others like perspectives were too ingrained. But that those were kind of the responses that I got.
And I'll put this out to the whole panel. It's something I've had put at me a lot over the years. You know, I I lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation with the Ogallala Lakota tribe for a few years, and I've been involved with the Black Hills Reclamation Project, and now, you know, this project in Connecticut. And I've had a lot of people say to me, you know, you're white, what business do you have in this? How would you guys respond to that?
I got this question a lot, and out of the six of us who are leading kind of the change in Manchester, none of us had like Indigenous roots. So I think sometimes we all got questions similar to this. And normally, what I said is like our population at Manchester High School, I think, was around 2%. Native American students or Indigenous students or students who identified as having like roots. And I said, well, the reason that we don't have a higher population can be traced directly back to like genocide of these people, and then later like erasure and isolation of the same groups of people. So like the reason that we don't have more Indigenous students here, like fighting this with us who go to our school, is like because we have systemically discriminated or like actually killed like so many people. So I would usually say that. And then also like it leads to a greater conversation around allyship and how you don't need to um, be part of a particular group to care about other people and care about people's rights.
Sure, and I think allyship is such an interesting idea within this context, because I've seen a lot of different people over the years, and I've seen people who are tribal members get offended by white people who seem to pretend that they're Indian while trying to do good things, or people who simply don't know how to be a good ally in a lot of different ways. So I'm interested, Shaquana, if you'd be open to speaking, what do you consider to be a good ally to tribal causes, and especially to this cause of getting rid of mascots?
I think anyone who's willing and open to learn and have respect towards their local indigenous peoples or just tribes all over. I think that having allies are great, and I mean, as long as they're respectful and like they're very knowledgeable and they're willing to learn, then I pretty much have no problem. I know that we've worked with like many people who are non-indigenous, who are just like very nice and open, and they have passion to help tribes all over. So yeah, I truly have no problem. I can thanked Katherine too. I'm like, she's great. Like everything that she's done, and I honestly didn't have a problem. I think that she's a great person and a leader. So
very cool, great. So I'll go back to you for a moment, Paul, about the moment that you think we're in right now in our society. I mean, I think it's relatively clear that we're having a moment of upheaval. I mean, the combination of everything stopping with COVID and the presidency that we just went through, and the police accountability that people are starting to demand. We're in a moment where there seems to be energy in the air. How do you think some of these social issues play into the mascot movement?
Yeah, I've been writing about these issues for over a decade. I've been writing about sports uniforms for over 2 decades, but I will say I didn't really kind of get on board with this and writing about the Native American imagery in sports until about 2010. And in that time, obviously I wasn't the first, and there was pushback against the Washington Redskins team name dating back to the 70s. There was pushback against the Cleveland Indians Chief Wahoo mascot dating back decades as well. But none of that really came to any kind of fruition until last year. And suddenly, like a lot of dominoes fell kind of all at once. There was a push from the financial sector and from big corporations that were partnered and sponsoring the Redskins to basically, there was a push for them to more or less divest from the team. And that was the final push that got the team owner, Dan Snyder, to agree to change or retire the longstanding team name. Soon after that, the Cleveland Indians announced that they will no longer be called the Indians after this season. In Canada, in the Canadian Football League, the Edmonton Eskimos have decided they're going to change their team name as well, because Eskimos is viewed up there similarly to the way Indians is here. And why did this all happen all at once? I do think it definitely had to do with the social uprising that took place after the murder of George Floyd last year, and that there was sort of a tipping point or an inflection point where a lot of things, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of things that had been okay just weren't okay anymore, and just couldn't be denied in that context. And so, yeah, I do think it's no coincidence that these changes are taking place now, and we've seen it ripple through, from big. I've just rattled off the names of top level pro sports teams, but we've seen it ripple down all the way to the high school and youth league level. So like there may still be 15 schools in Connecticut, as you mentioned, using Indian-based team names. But I strongly suspect that number was a lot higher a year or two ago, because all across America, school boards have been deciding, and communities have been deciding, not all of them, but many of them have been deciding to go in a different direction.
No, that's absolutely true. I know at least 4 in the past year in Connecticut that have, just off the top of my head.
And it's interesting because with the Redskins, people were, when the decision was made by Dan Snyder, the owner of the team, people were saying, well, he's not doing it because it's the right thing. It's not like he had a change of heart. He's just doing it because a bunch of corporations said, we're not going to advertise with you, or we're going to take our name off your stadium, or we're going to end our sponsorship agreements with you. He's just doing it because of money. And that may be true. Dan Snyder may have been engaged in a basically cynical exercise. He is not, he didn't suddenly see the light or have a change of heart. But why did those companies put pressure on him? Because their shareholders demanded it. And why did their shareholders do that? Because that's where we are now as a country, because there's been a change at the ground level. And that has ripple effects that go, in lots of different directions. And one of the ways it's rippling is up through big companies who can't afford to just ignore the popular will, because their profit line, their business literally depends on it. And I've heard people say, well, that's not a good enough reason, money, or a boycott. And I say boycotts have a really proud history in social justice, from the Montgomery bus boycott to divestiture from South Africa. That economic leverage is a form of freedom of association. It's who we choose to partner with and do business with. And we all make those choices every day, whether we're buying a pack of gum at the corner store or if we're a big company deciding where to spend money and resources. And it seems to me to be like the marketplace in action. And I think it doesn't cheapen the legitimacy of all of this in any way, just because Dan Snyder, the owner of the Washington football team, didn't do it for quote unquote the right reasons.
No, absolutely. And I think it certainly scales down as well. I mean, I did a little bit of looking into corporate relationships with Connecticut schools, and it as far as I could see, there's not a direct exclusive relationships with any corporations in high schools, but there are many sponsorships as far as pretty significant sized companies are jerseys, shoes, computers, and then there's smaller scale sponsorships as far as sponsoring things like signage at fields and stadiums and things like that. Professor Berger, so you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something else that is important for schools, which is not just sponsorship, but it's also attracting staff, teachers, and so on, and attracting new families to move to a town. So I know that something that came up a lot in Killingly was that it had become an issue in selling the school to, the best teachers. This is not a great image for to project to the community. And I also wanted to, just going back to your question about allyship, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Killingly fight that I'm not sure if was true in Manchester as well, is that it began not because of issues of necessarily that Native people were necessarily instigating it immediately. It had been under debate for many years, but there was a real racial reckoning in the school, particularly because of Black students who had been harassed and had fruit thrown at them from buses. And this made the school look at itself and its racial measures in a lot of ways, which kind of is, so it's more than just, it's both allying with Indigenous peoples, but it's also all of our ways in having schools that present a image of race and respect for other races.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'll go back to you, Paul, for a moment. I mean, where do you? The local issues are local issues, and I think they're going to change in different ways. And we certainly we need to put local pressure on, I think. But when you look at it at a national level, what's your expectations for what we're going to see in places like Atlanta with the Braves, Kansas City with the Chiefs, maybe Chicago with the Blackhawks, places that are using, professional sports that are still using these type of mascots?
I think it may take a little longer. From my perspective, I had always viewed the Redskins name and the Indians' Chief Wahoo logo as the sort of low-hanging fruit. One was a dictionary-defined slur, and the other was an obviously sort of grotesque racial caricature. And so, though I'm not surprised that those have been retired, I think people may need. I think in some people's minds, it's sort of like, well, okay, our work here is done, or people who oppose this movement and who want to retain these types of images may say, well, okay, I can sort of see that Redskins and all right, you can, we'll let you win those battles, but we're going to dig in on these other things. And I think it may take a little longer. We'll see. The problem is that for all these teams, including the Braves, including the Chiefs, you have fans doing the tomahawk chop. You have fans until I believe this coming season, the Kansas City Chiefs have said they're not going to allow fans to come in with native-based headdresses, but they have in the past. And it's a problem like that. Like if you're a sports fan, you should be able to paint your face in in whatever stupid looking way your team is based on. Sure. And obviously, Braves and Chiefs fans can't do that. And it sort of speaks to, well, if you can't behave like other sports fans in a socially acceptable way, then like what is the problem exactly with your, like there's a problem there. It speaks to like something isn't working here, and that even in years past, every year Major League Baseball puts out special caps for various holidays, including 4th of July, and so they have these star-spangled Stars and Stripes caps. And so for a few years, the Cleveland Indians were wearing these Chief Wahoo caps in a Stars and Stripes pattern, which was just, it was like irony on a plate or something. It was so ridiculous. It was absurd. And then they stopped doing it. And all the other teams had their primary logos, and the Indians cap had a secondary logo with the Stars and Stripes, not Chief Wahoo. And it was sort of like what I was talking about with the face painting. Well, if you have a basic approach to everything and this team doesn't fit into it because it's not appropriate to do that, well, maybe you should be asking yourself why it's not appropriate and what that means about your larger visual program. And so I think it may happen with the Chiefs and Braves, but I think it may take a little longer.
That makes sense. And I'll go back to you now, Professor Berger. We're at law school, so I want to talk a little bit. And this has been an area where there hasn't been a lot of successful legal progress. Honestly, there's been a lot of frustration in attempts from lawyers to move forward with cases to force this issue. The Washington football team's previous name is a huge example with the trademark case that came through and ultimately was not fruitful. Could you talk a little bit maybe about some of the history of the law that's tried to move to move this area, and maybe what some of your ideas of prospective litigation might look like, or some thoughts on what some of the backbones of that could potentially be?
Yeah, and in doing that, I just want to give a more hopeful image and also a more complex image of how law works. So as Paul mentioned, people have been trying to change the Washington team's name since the 70s. And in the 1990s, a group led by Muskogee poet and activist Joy Horcho brought an action to try to cancel the trademark so that they couldn't have exclusive rights to sell that trademark because it was offensive. And that case kind of went up and down in the court. So that was first, I think, filed in 1999. And It was ultimately dismissed on a procedural ground. A new case was brought, and that actually found success at the federal circuit level. And then a different case involving a team called, not a team, a band called the Slants, but run by I believe he's Chinese man, ethnic Chinese man. Not sure about that. But he wasn't able to register the name of his band because the trademark office said it was offensive. That case went to the Supreme Court, and they say you can't do that. That's too much viewpoint consideration. And it went, and this affected the litigation on the Washington trademark, and that case was dismissed. But so what happened in the interim? So this case, the original challenge was filed in 1999. That brought a lot of attention to the issue. And in 2001, the United States Civil Rights Commission said, this is bad, this is discrimination, this is causing harm to Native youth, this is promoting racial image in schools, and so all schools that are federally funded should retire these mascots. Continued getting litigated. What happens in 2005? The NCAA said, unless you have consent of the tribe, you can't use these images in postseason play. So in championship play, a big deal. And as a result of that, I think when this was done, 19 teams still had Native mascots, and 15 retired them, and others got consent from tribes and really changed what the mascots looked like. So a big example of this is from Florida State, where the Seminoles had this very cartoonish Sammy Seminole, and they really worked with the Florida Seminoles. I think the Oklahoma Seminoles still object to this, to change the way this looked. And so as this litigation has been pending, more and more attention has been paid to the issue. And so laws have passed in Oregon and Maine and been proposed here to prohibit these kind of mascots in educational settings and so on. So the litigation has not necessarily been successful yet, but it's really brought attention to the issues that these raise. And so very separate from the trademark issue is the issue facing schools, where there are specific requirements that schools provide do not have a hostile educational environment based on race. So both the federal Title VI, Connecticut state laws prohibiting discrimination could be involved here. And as you say, I don't know of successful litigation, but at least the U.S. Civil Rights Commission thought that this was a potential measure. And so those are ways to go forward on the school level.
I'm interested too in what your thoughts are on the impact of the tangible evidence that the Freiberg studies have provided. I mean, is that something that you think could be useful in litigation going forward? Because I know an analysis that's often been problematic is that the harm was unclear or wasn't quantified or wasn't being made directly in the case. Do you think the Freiberg data could be helpful?
Yeah, certainly the Freiberg data can be helpful. So if you're trying to prove like a hostile educational environment, you've got to show the impact on the students that receive this. And so both the Freiberg data is most prominent, but there's been meta-analysis of other studies, and they all find a negative impact of these kind of images and mascots, I think. So all of that would be significant.
Very good. All right, thank you. We are just about at 11:30, and I told the audience and you guys that we would try to put a half hour aside for questions. So let me see if I can figure out how to get them. If you have a question and you're in the audience, you can try to type it into the conversation tab, or you might be able to activate your camera and ask a question. I don't know. If not, I have plenty more questions to ask you.
Yeah, Spencer might be able to help us with that.
Yeah, I think you probably will. I did see at least one, but I just lost it.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat about legislation, and then it looks like we have a hand raised from Heidi Hernandez.
Okay, I see the question from Dana Washington. The question is, I saw somewhere that there is a bill in Connecticut about mascots and imagery to ban in schools. Can you have one of the panelists speak to the legislation that is on the table for Connecticut to eliminate all human mascots? What's the timing of that? Who was involved and when it is getting voted on? Does anyone like to speak on that? Does anyone have any knowledge about that?
I have a tiny bit of knowledge that this would have been similar in banning mascots unless there was consent of the tribe in the area, I believe. I saw this was pending, and I don't know what happened after that. A lot of things kind of didn't move forward with the pandemic. Maybe George knows more about
Sure.
it.
I have a little bit of knowledge about it. There were a number of things that were put into committee this session, and however credible you find the story, and I think there's certainly real issue there that COVID just jammed up this legislative session dramatically, and a lot of issues that needed to be addressed were just COVID related. But there were a number of bills that were put into committee that addressed removing the use of American Indian mascots in its entirety, and there were other laws that were brought and proposed about using removing humans as mascots in its entirety. There were different laws with different levels of broadness and specificity. As far as I am aware, and if there's anyone on the call who's better aware than I am, none of those laws that were specifically about mascots reached ever left committee to hit the floor for a vote in Connecticut. There was, however, one bill that did get out of committee, and I understand has passed or is likely to pass if it hasn't yet, and that is a curriculum bill. And in that curriculum bill, it addresses a number of underserved cultures. It's not solely American Indian culture. I know that there was a series of different additions to the curriculum, but American Indian studies would be a required part of curriculum in Connecticut schools. There's obviously complications in that. Who's making that curriculum? What's the tribal involvement in making sure that curriculum is accurate? I mean, it's a complex thing, but I think that that's what is most likely to come out of the legislation this year. However, as we heard Katherine say, a few people can make a big difference in this sort of thing. I think it's a great idea to get in touch with your representatives, to write them letters, to do a march in your town and invite them to it. I think it's a great way and really a good time to put pressure on our representatives to make them bring these things up to votes. And I think we could make some real progress. Let's see here. Yep, Darcy confirmed that right. Yes, the bill that was to ban Native American imagery in Connecticut didn't get to a public hearing or make it to committee. So that is right. Thanks, Darcy. And you said there was a hand up, Spencer? I don't see it. Can you?
Yes, Heidi Hernandez, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
That's Haiti.
Hi, yeah, it is Haiti. Thanks, Professor. So thank you so much, everyone, for your talk. I really appreciate hearing all these perspectives. I learned a lot. So I think you kind of touched upon it in your answer to the previous question, but are there any ongoing efforts, any organizing efforts in the state that we can support regarding changing mascots, or just generally supporting the Native American community in Connecticut? Like, where can we go? What can we do?
Sure. Would one of our panelists like to address that, or Professor Berger, or Shaquana, or Katherine?
I know there's like a group that, I work with Glenn Matoma, and I know he's been working hard with from UConn. And there's multiple other people on it. Like there's I'm pretty sure she's a teacher from Killingly. I'm pretty sure it's just being developed right now, and then I think more information will come about. But that's the only thing that I know that I'm a part of that have we've been working for probably about a year and some change now on that.
Right, that's sort of a different groups are sort of kind of congregating around that nucleus right now, and I can certainly share the link for that group's Facebook page because I think it's going to be growing and trying to bring a few different grassroots operations together to sort of pool our resources. And of course, you know, the CHRO is here. You know, this is something that, you know, by coming out and having a panel like this CHRO, the enforcement agency for the state of Connecticut, its anti-discrimination laws, is saying we don't think this practice is right, and we intend to take action to remedy that. So anyone who wants to reach out to help us in that process or express an interest in being part of those enforcements that we're going to be doing, whether it involves more outreach and education at the local level, you know, I'm happy to go and meet with your town councils or your boards of education, and you know, I'm happy to come and join your marches. And I think the CHRO is going to be behind your efforts, and the schools in Connecticut that are continuing to use these mascots need to know that they're being watched and they're going to have to change.
I wonder, so one question for you, George. What is the status of the Watertown effort? I know there's an active effort significantly driven by a recent UConn law alum to retire their Indian mascot and appoint. So you mentioned that the bill didn't make it out of committee. Why doesn't a bill make it out of committee? It may be there's strong opposition to the bill. It may also be that they recognize there's going to be blowback from a few people, and it's not in the news enough to, or in the public eye enough to make anything happen, to make legislators lose face if they don't bring it out of committee. And I want to hold
that's
up,
right.
yeah, the really coordinated effort to address zoning and income segregation in Connecticut, that it was a real coordinated effort that led to a really great bill making it out of committee for the first time. And if something like that happened around the mascot issue with people working that have worked in different towns came together to bring this forward, that might prevent, you know, get more traction in state legislation.
I think that's a great point. I think it's a really great point. I think that there's a lot of little fires in Connecticut right now. There's, like I said, there's about 15 high schools still using it, and there's people upset about the issue in those places, and there's people upset about the issue around the state. And what we're trying to do now, and I think one of the things that us being a state agency hopefully can bring to the table, is an organizing effort to bring those little fires together, take our energy, and then create something like a unified effort. Like, for example, you talked about the zoning, that was pretty successful, and bring it towards the mascot issue.
All right, it looks like we have another question from Tim Gabry. If you want to unmute.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Tim Gabriel. I'm from North Haven, Connecticut, which is one of those towns where there's little fires going on right now. And just before I have a question specific to the fight that's going on in our town, but I did want to clarify. I had reached out to some of the representatives and state senators who are working on the legislation, and they did confirm everything that was said here, that the bill didn't make it out of committee because of other priorities. What one of them did say is that there is still a possibility that it could make it into the budget bill that goes through. A lot of times they kind of tack on a whole bunch of like things that didn't make it through onto kind of like this last minute budget thing that goes on. So if you want to write to your legislators, you know, and suggest that this be part of that, or that this is a priority to you, I think that could definitely have an impact. It's probably not likely, but you know, it's not definitely done at this point. So in North Haven, Connecticut, you know, we are still the Indians at our school, although many of us are not actually Indians. And there's been a concerted effort to change the mascot in recent years that sort of started in 2015 when a student who was a alumni had kind of brought this to the attention of the Board of Education, did a lot of research, had a lot of input from local tribes and stuff like that, brought this before the board. There was a public outrage over this. There were death threats that were had. There were Native families in town that got threatened. And ultimately, the Board of Education never made a vote on it, but they made a decision within around 2017 that they were going to discontinue the use of the caricature that had been associated with the name, and they weren't going to print the name Indians on any new uniforms that came out. So now we've sort of been unofficially the Indians during this time, but it's not being printed on new uniforms. The caricature has not been used since 2017. And some of us have brought this up as an issue again to just kind of formally retire the mascot. Do you have a question, Catherine?
I just wanted to mention that it seems very similar to what happened in Manchester. And we had the same thing happen, a decision from the superintendent in 2012 to kind of de-emphasize it. And a lot of our work was and claims that we made to other students was like very centralized around the idea of us not having unifying mascot. So if anyone from North Haven wants to reach out to me, I can send you like information from what me and my peers, like arguments that we made like centrally related to the de-emphasis of the mascot. That I didn't really speak about too much here because I didn't know if the specifics of that applied to anyone here, but yeah.
No, thank you very much for that. I will definitely reach out to you after this. But my question is, one of the possible outcomes that I see happen is the board is going to have a vote to officially retire the caricature, but not the name. And I could see an outcome where we keep the name and not the caricature. So can you speak on the distinctions that you see between the iconography sometimes associated with these mascots and just the name itself?
Sure. One of the panelists like to speak to that? It seems like it might be a question that would be relevant for you, Paul.
To me, it's you can't really separate them that much. I mean, some logos or caricatures are particularly beyond the pale, like Chief Wahoo was, but it's still basically telling the same story. And we've seen with the Cleveland Indians, the team that had Chief Wahoo as their logo. First, they retired Wahoo, and then a few years later, they have now said that this will be their final year being called the Indians, because I think it's almost like a literal, in some people's minds, I think it's almost literally out of sight, out of mind, that if they get rid of the visual aspect of a logo, that solves the problem. But to my mind, it doesn't. If your team is still called the Indians or, the Savages or whatever the case might be, and everybody knows where it came from and what it was originally based on, it's still problematic. And people are still going to come to the event, doing war whoops and the tomahawk chop and wearing headdresses and all the rest. It's like basically if you do a half measure, you're basically still giving license to people to behave a certain way, and sort of with a wink and a nod.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's worth noting too is that through a lot of our conversation today, we've talked about how this representation can't possibly be done respectfully. There's damage being done regardless of intent, and I think we've talked about that quite a bit. But I think you also have to think about what you don't control the entire universe of something once you open it. I mean, sure, you could have a school, let's say in theory that, North Haven goes to just keep the name Indian. Like, okay, we're not going to use any of that imagery. You don't control the entire world of opening that box. I mean, maybe you don't have a painting in your cafeteria. Maybe you don't have a mascot at your pep rally. But the opposing teams, I mean, you're certainly opening a door for very troubling imagery, and I've seen pictures of it at Connecticut high school games where effigies of chiefs are being dragged by pickup trucks, saying to beat the other team. I mean, you don't control the full universe of something when you keep it open. By creating that opportunity, you're inviting hate speech, you're inviting discrimination. I don't think there's any realistic way to say we can control this. It's not real. Professor Berger?
Well, I thought I might have seen Shaquana want to speak. Did you want to speak to that? Yeah, and I think Paul brought up an excellent point that's from a non-native perspective, in some ways that's a terrible solution, that you don't get to do the crazy things with your team mascot that teams like to do in general. But I think that's one of the important aspects of the research, that even if you don't have what everybody can see as a stereotypical negative image, it still has that impact of both saying there's a particular racial cultural group that another group gets to hold up as theirs without any consultation with the group. And I don't know how much you guys are aware, but there is a real concern about sexual violence against Native women. And I think it comes from this idea that Native women's bodies are in part there for other people to use. And I do think that appropriating images of a racial group contributes to that. I used to have an Ojibwe student who said she chose not to go to a school, Central Michigan University, which was offering her a full ride because she didn't want to be at a school where she was the mascot. And that, regardless of what the image is, and they actually have gotten consent from one of the Ojibwe tribes, and there's, I think, still using it, which is controversial with the other Ojibwe tribes of Michigan, but it's still no good.
All right, and it looks like we have one hand up left from Cassandra Kellogg.
Yeah, thank you guys for this talk. It's been really interesting and helpful. And throughout a lot of this, we've kind of been talking about how the first step in making people aware of how this is harmful is through education and providing people with education that is full and also devoid of the kind of typical racism that we've often seen in education about Native people. And I have, that just kind of brought to my mind, we've also been talking a lot about these kind of grassroots movements to speak to our representatives to encourage having better programs for Indian education in schools. And I'm wondering, what are probably the most important steps in actually implementing something like that, if it were to be a program? I am working with an attorney right now, and we're actually looking in another state at a program instituted in this state that is meant to provide funds to schools to develop an Indian education kind of curriculum. And there has just been so many issues with this because there's so little oversight and there's hardly any communication with the tribes in the area. And so I'm just thinking, once we get to that point where we can implement a program, who do we need to be directly working with to make that happen in the best way, most effective way?
Would like to address that. I'm sure some of you have better thoughts on this than I do.
A couple of things, and as you say, reaching out to the tribes in the area is huge. And one of the things that I think all of us have discussed is one of the images it presents is that Native people are just in the past, and that their culture is something cool in America that can be appropriated and used as we wish. I mean, I was kind of shocked when my kid in kindergarten was supposed to pick an Indian name and make an Indian t-shirt. They had no Indians in the school. And this is quite a progressive school, right here in the supposedly progressive state. So, so two things: reach out to Native people. I don't know the organization specifically providing this organization, so this kind of education, so somebody else would have to give you information about that. But also make sure that it presents Native people as modern people, Native people as they are now, not just, look what happened when we first got here and they're not here anymore. So that's my thought.
I think you had some thoughts as well, Shaquana.
Yeah, so it was kind of around what Bethany said. Just reaching out, creating a relationship with your local tribes, and working closely with them to come out with the right curriculum that needs to be taught to everyone. That's basically what I was going to say.
I'm curious, has there been any reach out from Connecticut? Yeah, I don't know, it's very new in Connecticut, but has there been any conversations that you're aware of between your tribe and, I don't know, the curriculum committee, if that's a thing, whoever's going to do this in Connecticut?
Well, there hasn't really been a curriculum committee. There has been a few schools in Connecticut that have reached out, and I know within the tribe, I think they're forming like the right people to go about this to help them with the curriculum. Also, we had someone from I think Arizona or somewhere. They're doing like a really big curriculum on there. So there's been a few people who've reached out, and then I feel like it's fairly new that people are starting to reach out to the tribes. So I would just say definitely give the tribes some time to be able to form their own curriculum and, however they want it to be taught. Just continue to work closely with them.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more questions out there, Spencer?
Yes, one last one from Dana Washington.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for doing this talk. It's actually very, very informative and important. Just speaking up, not necessarily a question, but also a comment. And that is, with the curriculum development, we are seeing some small changes. So to Professor Berger's comment with the youth. So we are Nipmuc and Narragansett descendants, my daughter, as well as a couple of other people on the call as well. I know Wendy Marks' son is also on the Nipmuc Youth Council, and they are talking to our local Indigenous communities as well as our own about curriculum development, how we would like to position our imagery and our education throughout the school system. I know Shakana was actually a special hosted guest on a podcast that's just starting to really educate the youth on the No Dapple movement and some of the other Indigenous perspectives that come into the schools. I currently live in North Haven. I chose to send my daughter to a North Haven school system, and after some huge racial issues, we decided to pull her out and move her. And we remain very constant in the battle against human mascots and imagery throughout Connecticut, New England, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So just wanted to thank you all so very, very much, as well as some of the other people who are participants and listening in on this call, because it does impact our youth tremendously. I think that the way that we actually change this is through our youth, and to really start with the curriculum development is one step in a great direction.
Thanks, Dana. Thank you for all your work. Really appreciate it. And I also see, Wendy Jackson's story in the comments if anyone would like to take a look. And certainly I can, sorry you had to go through that, Ms. Jackson. Hopefully we can keep working on this and make it better moving forward. Is there any other, what podcast are you going to be on, Shaquana? Make sure you say, was it on or already, or is it going to be on?
Her name is Kendall Washington. The podcast is, I can't even.
I'm sorry, I think Dana just said it. What was it?
Hosting Heroes.
Hosting Heroes. So there we go.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think it's out yet because they haven't emailed me with back with them anything yet. But once it does come out, I can definitely send it.
Very good.
It was really great. She's a great girl.
I know, Paul, you have a podcast too. You can, if you're talking about issues, let us know.
Sure. My podcast is called Unified. I co-host it with Chris Creamer, who's basically the only other sports writer who focuses on uniforms and logos on a full-time basis. And we do discuss issues like this. We haven't done like a whole episode specifically devoted to it. Our podcast only started earlier this year. We've done 13 episodes, but it's out there on all the usual platforms. Unified.
Thank you. And I mean, I don't know. Everyone else seems to have cop podcasts nowadays. Professor Berger, Catherine, you guys know? No.
Everybody's doing it, man. Come on.
Yeah, I know.
No podcast, but the Manchester team, we were interviewed for a documentary that's coming out on Netflix called The R Word. I think that like production was halted during COVID, but I'll plug that.
All right, very good. Well, again, thank you so much today, guys. I'm humbled to have had such a great panel. Thank you for putting time aside for this, and I truly hope that we, were able to inform some people about issues they weren't quite aware of. So again, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, and I hope that we can all stay in touch and continue to grow these small fires into a big one here in Connecticut.
Thank you. Thank you for putting it together, George.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, all the participants.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.